Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, where today we will be discussing an article entitled The Warden's Columns.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our thoughts and opinions are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions via our website at theworkingtoolspodcast.com.
Today on the Working Tools Podcast, we have our usual cast of characters here. We have Worshipful Brother Stephen Chung from Prince Charles Lodge 153 in Kelowna, British Columbia. We have Jarrod Dunham, who's a past master up in Penticton, British Columbia. He's a member of Penticton Lodge number 147. Very Worshipful Brother David Colbeth, who's a member of King Solomon Lodge number 60 down in Auburn, Washington. And I'm very Worshipful Brother Matthew Appel, and I'm a member of Mill Creek Lodge in Montlake Terrace, Washington. And we welcome you all to the show. Today we're going to be discussing an article entitled The Warden's Columns, which is, we don't have an author, it just says author unknown on the title, on the article here that we have. But it was given to or forwarded to us by Norm McAvoy and his excellent website, theeducator.ca, all those words, theeducator.ca. And it's an excellent website with all sorts of great articles on it. And this is one that we pulled off of there. And we will have a link to that website in our notes, so you can go and read it if you like. And so we each, as I said, I believe last episode, we're each have been choosing our own articles, and this article was chosen by our own Stephen Chung. So Stephen, go. Why did you choose this article, and what did you enjoy about it? What was it about for you?
Well, it was just a random pick, actually. I just thought, it'd be an interesting thing to talk about the Warden's columns. And then as I, took the time to read the article, it's actually, it spreads into so many different directions that it's quite interesting to see the evolution or innovations in Freemasonry as time goes on, right? This particular article, at the beginning, it talks about the simple rule everybody in today's Freemasonry understands, that the senior warden and junior warden have the pillars on their pedestals, and when the lodge is at labor, the senior warden has it erected. When it's at refreshment, the junior warden has it erect. And it goes on to make comments like things about when you open your lodge, and one of the first things that's forgotten commonly is the switching of the positions of the columns, and the sideliners are often quick to point out that you forgot to change your columns, guys, or one or the other guys did.
One of the things that's never an innovation of Masonry is the sideline talk.
yeah, right. That's never an innovation, right? But and the paper goes on actually to state that it made their first appearance in Masonic ritual as late as 1760, where speculative Masonry, there was a book, The Three Distinct Knocks, a well-known expose of Masonic ritual, and it published that year with the first description of the wardens using their columns. And then it also goes on to where William Preston, in some of his illustrations of Freemasonry from 1792 to 1804, had them as the deacons in care of the deacons. And then, as it goes on, it even changes it again, where, an Irish lodge in the 18th century had a bylaw reading where there's to be silence at the first chap of a master's hammer, and likewise at the first stroke of each truncheon stuck by the senior and junior warden. So they actually had truncheons there, not columns. And so, but they were kind of used in the same way.
What's a truncheon?
And it's a truncheon is like a billy club. Where is it? An emblem of authority. Where is it? they had trenchants whose modern function is to serve as a billy club for policemen, right? So that's what a trenchman was. But actually, that actually brought up another thing. I've never heard this reference before as the first chap of a master's hammer. And like, I've never heard it referred to as the hammer. It's always been referred to as the gavel in every circle I've been. And a chap it's always been referred to as the rap of the master's gavel, right? And so this different terminology was also interesting too. So yeah, that's the progression of this paper, and the, you know, it goes to show that in different parts of the world, different lodges, you know, things are different. But I mean, that goes back to in BC here, we've got 4 different types of rituals too. So, you know, it kind of doesn't surprise me that the different references from the different parts of the world.
We should probably talk about what they mean in lodge, right? The columns or the pillars. So what do
I was
they
about
mean?
to say, so yeah, for those who might be recent additions to the craft or who aren't Masons, in the Masons lodges, the master sits in the east, generally speaking, and the senior warden in the west, and the junior warden in the south, and the junior warden and senior warden in the lecterns that sit before them, where they keep their whatever paperwork and stuff to run the meeting effectively. It also will have it's basically a small representation of an actual column. It's usually, I don't know, 12, 18 inches long. I'm not sure what that is in centimeters for our brothers north of the border, but about yay long. And it's that they will set up, as Steve said, the senior warden will set his up, will set his, so it's vertical when the lodge is open, and when the lodge is at refreshment, the junior warden will set his vertical and the senior warden will put his down. I've actually been to lodges, interestingly, where there was actually attached to the lectern with a hinge. So I guess that way you don't forget to put it out before the meeting. it's always there. But it's just sort of a way, if you were standing in the lodge, if you walked in and the meeting was already started, you could look around and sort of see what was going on around you and know where the lodge was. You could look at the altar and look at the columns and figure out what degree you're on and what's going on around you. So
yeah, and another thing that that's okay. Apparently they've, you know, it's been understood that they represent different things depending on what part of the world you're in. Like at one place, here's the senior and junior wardens columns represent the pillar of beauty and strength. You know, because it's in Freemasonry, you know, there should be wisdom, which is the column of the worshipful master, wisdom to contrive, and strength to support, and beauty to adorn all great undertakings, right? So, you know, the 3 pillars of Freemasonry are also known as the square of the compass and the volume of sacred law. So where they cross over, it was confusing to me for a bit there. But when you think of the different rituals from the different parts of the world, it wasn't really too surprising. Something's got to confuse somebody so they can ask a question, right?
One of the things that I stumbled across was the idea that, incidentally, you mentioned that they're attached by hinges, because in one of the things I read that they said there was that the wardens would carry them in procession. So it relates back to the idea of the Irish Lodge, where they would carry them where there were billy clubs actually used to enforce whatever they might need to enforce, I suppose. I don't think I've ever seen anybody meaningfully strike someone with one of the columns, but one of the warden's columns, but I suppose they could have been used certainly to represent who they were in procession, but kind of like the marshal does with his baton. But they're already wearing the jewel of their office and likely the apron of their office, and so I would be a little bit surprised that they would need to have an additional element to adorn themselves during a procession. But I suppose if you're going to move, you know, in some lodges too, do they do this in Canada where I've heard some lodges, they don't start in lodge, they start out of the lodge and come into the lodge room and then take their stations and places, and then the master comes in a procession, and so the wardens at that point would bring their column in with them and then place it on the in their position wherever they might be. And especially we talk about in the ancient brethren met in a high hill or a low dale. They didn't have a cupboard to put their stuff away in, so they had to bring it with them. So they have to bring it from somewhere. So I would imagine the wardens maybe, although from what we've read, it's an innovation, and so probably didn't have columns when they were meeting on the high hill or low dale.
Anyway, I've never seen where they start out of the lodge.
Uh-huh.
I've never experienced that. Is anybody else?
I've not seen it. I just heard about it.
My understanding is it's an English thing. I have seen, like, especially documentaries on British lodges where I don't know if the members process in, but the officers definitely process in. So as part of their opening.
Yeah, and I know there's even in some rituals I've seen in music anyway. I've seen the master's procession, basically the entitled master's procession. So there's obviously an entrance of sorts for them to come in, and then where we're not to go into too much detail, but the master's declaration when he's first opening the lodge, first about to begin to open the lodge, is an instruction for the guys: hey, get in there and sit down because we're about to come in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting too that these columns that we call them columns, or there's a crossover between the word column and pillar, and that is a different. One of the things I found was that even in some dictionaries the word column has a synonym, the word pillar, and vice versa, but pillars. One spot I found was that the pillars aren't always round. The column is a round pillar. And it was interesting to hear. And if you listen to some of our lectures, which are pretty well published for anybody to find, it talks about how the idea, one of the concepts of how the ideas of the columns or pillars were developed is through the taking trees basically and wrapping them with to create a covering and to create a shelter. And so they would wrap the trees that went across the top with vines and other material to attach it, which then gave light to the idea of the ornamentation of the top of the pillars or columns. And so if you were to hew that tree into a timber, it would be square. It would still be a pillar. But if it was the whole tree, if you didn't really hew it, could be a column. But then the stones, interesting that they made the stones round in columns rather than making them square like pillars.
That's because a cylinder is stronger than a cube. That's mainly from a mathematical perspective, a cylinder holds pressure down on it better than a square. Because with it being round, all the pressure gets pushed out uniformly.
Well, there you go. And that's the end of the show.
Actually, well, it's interesting because this article, I as I do with whenever I read an article, is I went to my books and started looking up other things for it. And I came across another book that discusses the Warden's columns being used because most Masonic meetings used to happen at a table. And so when they were doing their business at a table, and of course, Masonic meetings apparently involved toasts and everything, but when they got to a point where they would be possibly eating a meal, therefore not at labor, they needed some indicator on the table for the brethren to know whether they were at labor or at refreshment, and so what they can and cannot discuss. And it discusses the fact that that's where possibly the Warden's columns come from, in that they're just little, so they're sitting on the table and you're like, okay, well, what can I talk about? Oh, we're at refreshment, so I can talk about anything. So I thought that was interesting.
Did it give illusion that there might be guests, people that they couldn't or shouldn't talk to in that instance? I mean, if you're just sitting around a table of Masons and you know them all to be Masons, then...
Well, I think it basically discussed how the fact that meetings were held at a table, not sort of sitting in a lodge like we do it now.
Yeah.
And so you had to know whether you were doing ritual, I guess, basically whether you were in the middle of doing a proper meeting or if you'd stopped to have a meal and, So, you couldn't say, oh, you can't put your fork that way because that's not written in there.
Which many times, as much as we got a joke about having table meetings or, it does seem to think that would probably make the night more interesting. If you had some ritual to open and then you had a meal, and while you're at meal, you'd talk about the bills, and you have a little formal process where you pay the bills and you have a little education, and then you can talk amongst yourselves and have that. And then at the end of the night, you close. And if you want to stay later, you can. That does seem to be quite appealing, the idea.
That sounds like a table lodge to me. And, we have one of those annually, pre-COVID, we had one of those annually at our lodge. And, that, it actually makes sense with, to have both the pillars. I don't know why you need two pillars. Either you're at labor or you're not. So really, to me, in my mind, the senior warden's pillar would be enough. Just to say, yeah, we're at labor. No, we're not. Yeah, we are. No, we're not.
But if you only have one column, your lodge is incomplete.
Yes, right. Now it depends on what the representation is, right? Some it was an ornamental thing. Sometimes they talk about it was just the representation of the two pillars of King Solomon's temple, But then there's this other section in here. It reads, from the creation of such pillars from their association with the three principal officers of the lodge, undoubtedly came the columns of the wardens. They are relics of those earlier large pieces of furniture from the traditions of operative craft lodges and had lingered in the conception of the senior warden as the officer in charge of the workmen. His column naturally represented his authority and superintendence. And so to give the junior warden some similar authority and imaginative, speculative, ritualistic probability hit on the idea of putting him in charge of the craft during refreshment. And that idea had been foreshadowed in Anderson's 1723 constitutions and regulations, put the grand wardens in charge of the annual feast, right? So it's like they were used as representation of authority at the same time. It's kind of interesting that way. And it goes on to talk about the miniature versions, as Dave was saying, where they would be carried in processions, right? Which I thought was also interesting because the only processions I know of were in the third degree, right? And they didn't carry their columns with them. So,
but if you proceed. Sorry.
Pardon? No, go ahead. What was that?
I was going to say, but it makes sense that if your lodge is one where the officers process into lodge, carrying their columns would make sense. And I think that might be where that is coming from.
Yeah, that would make total sense. Yeah.
And it's interesting too that they were trying to draw the idea where the innovation came from, and that it was maybe that these officers, the annual communication or the Grand Lodge session, the guy was hey, we're going to give this guy something to do. He's just sitting there during the meeting. He's not really in charge, even though we call him an officer and he's elected. Hey, he should be in charge of the food. Okay. Give him a column. Give him some indication. And so I would be, maybe this is a great idea for a topic, although it's not what paper that I've read yet, but how we went from the table. Because I would agree that the idea of the Goose and Gridiron, although I saw some information on Goose and Gridiron, the idea of the true table lodge, or how Masons originally likely met in the very beginning, in the 17th century and 18th century, around a table, just at a bar, essentially a tavern, and then they moved into these ceremonial rooms. So I'd be curious to know how that process moved from one to the other, and became these grand processions and processes.
We should look for one of the documents on that. I'm sure there's got to be one. There has to be, because, we go from, we have naturally evolved into these lodge rooms that are very ornamental and very decorative. And, they say that everything is, our knowledge is illustrated by symbols and veiled in allegory, right? Well, everything in our lodge halls now has some sort of meaning, representation, or lesson, or represents something, right? So it would be interesting to see that or hear a paper on how we evolved our meetings and into these elaborate lodge halls versus from what we started, I'm sure.
RJ, Robert Johnson, who was on our show a couple months ago, actually does a whole presentation on Freemasonry in America and its tavern beginnings, or tavern, it's starting to, something like that. He does a whole presentation on it, which I have not actually seen, but I think maybe we should just get him back on.
You should reach out and ask him if he wants to come out and talk about that.
I just might.
Yeah, and if he's got that presentation video recorded, send us a link. If he's got the paper on it, send us the paper. I'd be interested to talk to him about it for sure. And but going back to this idea of the pillars, their representation or their connection, they're saying to Jachin and Boaz, it kind of takes it away from just using it as a symbol of power and authority as well, because it's often referred that they're supposed to represent the two pillars of Jachin and Boaz.
Which I think is going to lead us down another route. I think that our assuming we're going to continue talking about pillars, I think that's going to be a whole segue that's going to lead us into another conversation. So I think we probably have to round it up here, if you will, and then maybe we'll talk about that in the next segment if that works for everybody.
Yeah, I think we should get into what the columns mean in general to a lodge, columns and pillars mean in general to a lodge, and more than just what the Warden's columns necessarily. But you know me, I'm game for anything.
Even though that is the title of the conversation. But anyway,
yeah, for episode 2 on this topic, that sounds a great idea.
All right,
lead us into that, Matt.
On that note, I guess that's on behalf of David and Jarrod and Stephen and myself. Thank you all for listening. And as always, if you have any comments or thoughts or anything on our discussion here, please leave some comments, and we are happy to read them and consider them and talk about them, because we'll talk about just about anything, let's face it. And we always find the input from our listeners to be very valuable. So thank you all for listening, and we look forward to talking to you next week on the Working Tools Podcast. Goodbye.